International Studies today, and thanks also to our friends at FICCI for agreeing to come over. The CEO's delegation that's accompanying the Honorable Finance Minister. This is obviously a very busy time in this town, and we've got multiple events happening inside the building at the exact same time, so it's terrific that people took time out of the day for, I think, an important conversation about the U.S. India economic relationship. As those of you that attend CSIS events with some frequency know, we start every meeting with a security briefing. I guess that brings our insurance rates down by 2% every year. If something happens, if there's a fire or something else, I am your security officer for the meeting today. So you can follow me outside running and screaming and however you feel, and back over to the National Geographic headquarters behind us on 17th Street. So we don't expect anything to happen, but just in case it does, that's the deal and the agreement here. Well, so the world's finance ministers arrive in Washington, D.C., and they're all for the World Bank IMF meetings, but I can be sure that pretty much everyone is keeping an eye in terms of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and what's happening with the White House, with world events that are taking place every day, and actually taking place via Twitter just as much as they're taking place inside quiet diplomacy rooms. I don't think leading up, the election time, that India necessarily rated that highly in terms of voters' eyes across the United States. Other issues that I think helped lead to this, what was a surprising victory by President Trump. You had concerns on international issues of the rise of the Islamic State, of Islamic extremism, of China, the relationship there, Mexico trade. But neither for good nor bad was India really a major factor, I think, in terms of voting patterns and interest from the group that brought him to power. So I think when he takes office, there isn't a baked-in strong India agenda at the front of his mind necessarily. And that's neither a good nor a bad thing. But I think with the progress we've seen, you would at least like to see continuation. But hiring those middle staffers as well has been a relatively slow process, as we were talking about downstairs before this began. So in terms of trying to write the agenda, if it's not a White House-driven agenda point in terms of articulating the vision for India, and you don't have a lot of those senior staffers below that are really kind of driving things, it's a little bit unclear. We had some engagements. The Foreign Secretary was here in recent weeks. The National Security Advisor, our National Security Advisor, visited India. So I think the level of attention and interest is you're starting to see it really kind of build. Here at the India program at CSIS, we kind of look both at the economic relationship as well as the defense and security relationship. And in some ways, the two are mirror images of each other. The defense relationship, you've had terrific government-to-government interactions, signing powerful agreements, shaping a new vision, and now they're just trying to figure out ways to bring that to reality. How do we turn these great visions that we've signed together into something real and substantive? On the economic side, it's the reverse. The governments can't seem to get together and come up with anything positive and meaningful in some ways. We don't, 9 years later, we've made no movement on our investment treaty. We're part of the different trading blocks with TPP and RCEP. Our positions at the WTO tend to be at odds. But real businesses, the folks that actually matter for investing and bringing jobs, there's plenty of action happening both ways. So governments have had a tough time there, but businesses really see good things going on in recent years. The economy in India, I think by any measure is booming. It's one of the largest destinations for foreign investment. It's growing larger than any other large economy these days. And even U.S. India trade is up by about 2% in the last 12 months versus the prior 12 months, which isn't too bad considering the sort of global headwinds that we face in this environment with trade. I think even, by and large, you look at the numbers about the U.S. economy, and it probably isn't as bad as it's sometimes portrayed, especially around election time. But still, we sort of feel that we're punching below our weight, even if the numbers show that in terms of unemployment and growth, we're doing quite good. So we expect to see, in terms of defining those core agenda points between the U.S. and India, a lot of work happening because sometime, probably this summer, hopefully we'll get a summit meeting set up between Prime Minister Modi, who's been invited to come to Washington, D.C., and President Trump. So certainly when the bosses get in the same room, you hope to have a little bit more to hang the hat on in terms of what the new era of relations are going to look like. Well, that's why it's very exciting to get this opportunity to host the delegation from FICCI and be able to pick the brain of a couple of prominent CEOs that understand the U.S. environment very well as their own environment in India, and just to get some ideas, what might the next phase of the U.S.-India economic relationship look like? I don't think the governments have defined it yet, so this is our opportunity to put a line in the sand and say, here's some pretty good ideas from one of the organizations that really does lead policymaking in India. So it's terrific to have you here. Let me just introduce the three other speakers that are on stage. Starting all the way on my left is my terrific colleague here at CSIS, Matt Goodman. Matt is the Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS, exploring current issues in the international economic environment with the focus on Asia-Pacific policy, and is also the godfather of what I think is one of the great new initiatives here at CSIS, Reconnecting Asia, which is really trying to unpackage these monster announcements you see across Asia for these huge infrastructure projects. Who's funding them, who's winning them, things like that. So it's a real pleasure to get to work with Matt. Next to him is Pankaj Patel, who's Chairman and Managing Director of CSIS Cadila and also the President of FICCI. CSIS, I'm sure you're all familiar, discovers and develops, manufactures, and markets healthcare therapies in over 50 countries around the world. It's got 1,200 researchers across 19 sites as well, so really leading in the forefront in terms of using India's terrific potential to deliver great healthcare around the world. And immediately to my left is Harsh Neotia, who's Chairman of Ambuja Neotia Group and former President of FICCI. The group is very active across the range of real estate sectors, housing, hospitality, healthcare, and education. Conferred with the Padma Shri by the Honorable President of India in 1999 for his outstanding work in social housing. So a great group to have here. I'm going to ask Matt to kind of kick things off and give us the perspective of what we see and we think we know so far from the Trump administration on economic, and then I'll turn over to Pankaj. Please,
Great.
Matt.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for having me, and thanks to FICCI, and it's delightful to be up here on stage with colleagues and friends from FICCI, and I think it's safe to say that I'm the least knowledgeable person about India on this stage, so I'm going to not bluff. I may say a few things about U.S. India at the end, but let me just contextualize this a little bit by talking about Trump economic and trade policy. So Donald Trump was the first president in the United States to come to office without a single day of work in public policy, in government, or the military. So he didn't have very strongly held views on most of the issues that he is now dealing with, at least until a year or two ago when he decided to run for president. But there was one exception. There was one issue that he has had a view on, a very firm view, for 30 years. Literally 30 years. 1987, he gave his first big sort of public policy speech, and it was mostly about trade. And it was about how the United States is being taken advantage of in the international trading system, particularly by certain countries, and he named Japan as the leading source of his anxiety, his concern at that time. And he was going to do something. Somebody needed to do something about it. That became, I'm going to fix it, when he ran for president. So this has been a long-standing view of his for 30 years. And really very little changed, except that the focus shifted a bit from Japan to China, and Mexico more recently. So I think you might have questions about what he believes on North Korea, or building walls, or healthcare reform, or immigration even, but I think on trade you can believe that he's got a strong view. Now, as a candidate, he was very specific about some of the things he was going to do. In fact, on day one, he literally he gave a speech. I think this is the first time he actually enumerated these as day one commitments. In October, the month before the election, he was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he gave a speech in which he outlined what he was going to do on day one. And after a couple of sort of administrative issues about, banning lobbying and various things and cleaning up government, he got right to trade, and he said, I'm going to withdraw from TPP, I'm going to notify Canada and Mexico that I'm going to renegotiate NAFTA, I'm going to call China a currency manipulator, I'm going to tell my Commerce Secretary to launch a study of trade practices with an eye towards new trade action. And he didn't in that, but in other campaign speeches, he talked about the possibility of imposing unilateral tariffs as high as 45% on Chinese imports, or 35% on Mexican imports, and implying he might do that to others as well. So it was a pretty radical new agenda for trade, very different from what Hillary Clinton was saying, even though she had opposed TPP and had raised concerns about trade agreements, and certainly very different from what previous presidents have done on trade. So it got everyone's attention. And here we are almost at day 100. I think April 29th is day 100 of the administration, and very little of that has happened. One thing that matters a lot to me has happened, is that he's withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He did do that on day one, and that we can talk about, but that was, in my opinion, a self-inflicted wound that we didn't need to do, and that has really damaged our position in the world, but certainly in the Asia-Pacific region. But all the other things that I mentioned have not happened yet. So people are saying, it's the dog that hasn't barked, except that you haven't read Sherlock Holmes if you use that expression, because that's not exactly what the story was about. It was actually the dog not barking was a sign of something being wrong, because normally a dog would bark when an intruder came in the house and murdered the poor victim, but the dog didn't bark, so it made Sherlock Holmes suspicious. And people often conflate this, but that's the meaning that I have about the dog not barking. That is, it makes me suspicious that we have not seen him act on this 30-year viewpoint. And so I'll come back to that, but I think, well, actually, I'll come right to it. There are a number of things that I think are still pending that could happen. It's true he has not called China a currency manipulator, but he still is very concerned about currency practices. He's still talking and tweeting about it. And I think, depending on how rates move in certain countries, and by the way, there is downward pressure on the Chinese currency. And so if the Chinese were not intervening to stop that, which is why they're not manipulating under the terms of the law, that could be very problematic from a Trump perspective, and he could change his view on that. Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea are all vulnerable in this regard. So I think that's still hanging out there. Also, there's been talk of making currency manipulation a countervailable subsidy and applying that to the Commerce Department's assessments of subsidy action. Probably WTO illegal, but that gets to another thing, another shoe that may drop, which is that although he has not, formally, obviously, even done any action towards withdrawing from WTO, as he hinted at in the campaign, he has actually suggested that and written this down in various documents, that if we have rulings go against us in the WTO, we may just ignore them and move ahead. So that's hanging out there. There's also the prospect of the NAFTA negotiations being, although so far it seems as though there's just going to be an effort to sort of tweak it and change small things, you still hear occasional hints of this being a more radical reform, including from his Commerce Secretary, Mr. Ross, who's been put in charge of this. Also, one final thing that's sort of still out there is you don't have a U.S. trade representative yet. Robert Lighthizer has been nominated but not yet confirmed. He has a history as a deputy USTR of being quite assertive, aggressive, particularly on the defensive side of the job, and he negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan, for example, in the 1980s. And he's been a lawyer working on dumping and countervailing duty cases in the steel and coal sectors and so forth. So it's also, we're waiting for him to come in office and see what he actually does. And then final point is that there is this tussle going on within the administration over who's in charge of trade. So there are at least 3 people who are already in charge of trade, it seems. Peter Navarro, this economist who's been appointed the head of the new National Trade Council, Mr. Ross, the Commerce Secretary, and Mr. Cohn, the National Economic Advisor, has also clearly been very involved in policymaking. And Lighthizer would be another force. So how this all plays out, and you've seen evidence in both directions. I know, the other point I was going to make was that yesterday there was, Trump instructed his Commerce Secretary to look at steel practices through a national security lens. And that would be new, different, and frankly troubling if we were to do that. So all that's out there, and so what I wanted to emphasize all that just to say, don't get too relaxed about the fact that there haven't been shoes dropping on trade. I still think, especially given that 30-year view of Mr. Trump, that may be coming. Just one quick word on India. So I think there's good news and bad news about our relationship with India. I expect Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi to hit it off based on what we've seen with his relations with other leaders. I think there will be the same impulse to try to draw the two countries closer together from a strategic perspective. I think they will, in principle, want a good economic relationship. And the final piece of good news is that India is not sort of above the radar screen in terms of the hierarchy of countries that that Trump has expressed concern about, which are really China, Mexico, Germany, Japan, now Canada. Yesterday got dinged. So Canada's moved up maybe, and India therefore down. So you're not in the target here in the sights. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's just a long list, as you know, of trade irritants between the two countries that's going to come back to haunt us. Whether tariff and services barriers, regulatory transparency, IPR problems, and so forth. And I think it's very possible that those things are going to come back to haunt this relationship as well. And very final point, investment. There's been hope of a bilateral investment treaty between the two sides. I don't think Donald Trump is interested in BITs or even in promoting the interests of American corporations in countries like India, because that's great for Indian workers, but it's, in his view, not good for American workers. And so I don't think he's going to be a champion, as previous administrations have been, of American companies in foreign markets. That's a whole other conversation, but I think there's going to be a different dynamic on those issues. Sorry to talk so long.
No. So maybe the insurance FDI cap won't be talking point number one for a couple of weeks. So that'd be a big difference after 15 years of unbroken FDI and insurance policy from the United States, I think. Right. Those are some terrific thoughts. Pankaj, President Defiki, it's so great having you here on stage, and thanks for bringing the CEO group over here. Over to you.
Yeah, I think I'll touch base on the India thing, and my colleague would take up some of the sector-specific opportunities. What I see in India is that when Modi government came in 2014, there was a major change happened in the Indian political scenario, where after a very long time we had a stable majority government, not a coalition government in real sense, and also in the process the government which has also strong views, at times controversial, at times not controversial, but very strong views. And as a result, what really happened is that the challenges which the Indian political scenario had, in terms of whether it's about not having a level playing field for people in business, or having corrupt practices, etc., all were largely controlled when the new government came in. And at least at the political class, it did happen. What also happened along with that is that the government actually took some very, very bold move. And I think all of you know this, but the move the Modi government did about the currency is really a big move. Because I don't think any government anywhere successfully done this as what happened in India. And what happened in the process is that whole economy got a shock, but people in India accepted it because it was for the good of the nation. And the first time it was realized that the Indian people love the country. If there is something good happening for the country, people will go with the government, in spite of the fact that there was a lot of problem and issues along with that, because money is not available, etc. It also gave opportunity for government to put a digital push. What happened now, as we see, that there was about 16 lakh crore rupees worth of notes of high denomination of 500 and 1,000 were in the market. They were all withdrawn. What they have now released is 14.5 lakh. So a significant amount of currency has gone out of the market, number one. Second thing is happened, the banks have got lot of cash deposits in their bank now, As a result, banks have extra liquidity available for funding projects. Of course, there are no takers at this moment, but obviously, bank will find that happening. And on top of it, what really has happened is that as a result of that, the interest rates in India has smoothened because the bank got a lot of money at low cost. And as a result, the interest rates also have come down by about 1% or so. Coupled with that, the next move which the Modi government did was coming out the biggest tax reforms for the country, which is the goods and service tax. And that has actually helped, which will help India to actually grow even better. You know that we grow at about 7% now, but we are expected to actually improve this by about 1 to 1.5%. Another good point about this new GST regime is that it is the first time where goods and service tax will come. In spite of a new tax coming in, overall tax rates will come down. So what is happening towards is more compliance, or the tax compliance is what is being practiced and is what is going to be advocated through this, but actually the tax burden on people will actually come down, and one would expect that would have a lot of positive impact on the economy. The other big thing they did is about the infrastructure push, and now India builds every day about 40 kilometers of road. India has a huge investment happening in the railways and airports and etc. And all these projects, and I think we just were discussing about this thing about infrastructure. I think there is tremendous opportunity in all these areas happening, and there are a lot of PPP projects are also happening in the process in this infrastructure area. The other thing is that India has become the most open country in the world as far as foreign investments are concerned. So it's everything people can invest is fully automatic route. There's nothing really have restriction on foreign investment in India. So that also has really opened up. So I think if you see from a economic reform point of view, a lot of things are happening, and we believe very strongly some of the more important things will happen as a process after the last election, state election, the government, the ruling government won. The government has consolidated their position and become much more stronger. And if I can say, I have not seen India to be in such a good position for many, many years. So it's something like India in a very, very good position, a very sweet spot of growth and development happening. Now, with that in mind, India always had an interesting relationship with USA. Though both the countries have been a kind of a living democracy in the world, largest democracy in the world. India may be number one, then US number two in terms of size. The relationship are not as strong as one would expected because of the kind of political systems both the countries follow. But however, we have seen over the last several years that the relationships have improved a lot, and a lot of defense-related things happen. Both the presidents previously, President and the Prime Minister had good rapport. I believe then when Mr. Modi will visit here, maybe this summer, he would be able to also maybe develop a good relationship with the US President to actually take this thing to next level. The challenge, what we see is that people feel that India only asks for investment in India. I don't think that's true. We did a survey of Indian investment into US maybe about 3 years back, and at that time the number came out was about $100 billion have been invested into US. And of course, hundreds of and thousands of jobs are being created in US. If you see your healthcare system today, the US healthcare system has a lowest cost drugs available, because today, some of you might be aware, but about 40% of prescriptions which are filled in US are from the products produced in India and supplied here. So, and of course they are here because the cost is lower. So I think there is lot many things in terms of directly, indirectly, Indian people and Indian diaspora is actually working here. If you see now, go to major universities or major research institute, you will find quite a few number of Indian origin people, bright, young, talented boys working there,
More than a
creating
few.
kind of IP.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there are a lot of things happening. If you see from even from US point of view, some of the large US corporations like GE, for example, have a large R&D setup in India, and they have been able to get very productive output out of it. Number of patents are being filed through this research center, which is located in India. So I think one of the area of concern between India and US was always about IPR being talked about. So I think the government of India came out with a comprehensive IPR policy recently, and if you see this comprehensive IPR policy, that was clearly indicating towards making everything seamless and fully compliant to the international treaties what we have. Of course, there has been always been discussion about having something more than that what is agreed in the TRIPS and WTO agreement. India would have a very strong position saying that we would only respect what we have agreed on a multilateral treaties. There are of course no bilateral treaty thing. The challenge between US and India at this moment I see is that IT sector, which is one of the very important sector which is providing services, have a challenge now with the visa restriction which is likely to happen. Of course not happen yet. But if you see from a trade balance point of view, which Mr. Trump is talking about, the trade on the service sector, the trade balance is hardly any there. There is only a kind of, India has something like about $4 billion extra additional business compared to what US companies get into India. So if you look at from that perspective, there is hardly any, but if there is something going to happen to this, then the service sector things would become changed. But I think one of the things one has to understand that because these services are available, US corporations have benefited in terms of improving productivity, efficiency of their organization, maybe more profitable and more competitive in the world. And I think this is something where creating US job, I think it is important, and as we would think about creating India job. But I think it is also important to understand that we just cannot have one-sided kind of situation. So that's an area of concern. I'm sure that now that there is a thinking going on, the think tank in the Trump administration might come out with a more constructive approach towards making sure that there is a balance between having visa or not having visa, etc. There have always been another area which been talked about is kind of a regulatory thing, and I believe that I don't think that's a real challenge. In fact, if you see this, US also has many regulatory issues, like if you're bringing in some food product into US, there are some US regulations, and if you want to do the business, you have to follow that. And similarly, if you want to do something in India, there might be some local regulations protecting the people and for their safety or other reason, and that have to be respected if you are trying to do a trade and business. So I don't see that as an issue. Some of the things being talked about is that there is a kind of a preferential treatment for local manufacturing, but I believe that's what even exists in US. That if you want to supply to VA or the government agencies, etc., it has to be made in USA. You cannot just import and supply. That's the way the rules, regulations are. So I think there are not, I personally feel there are not too many issues that really become issue. Actually, India offers a very large market
in the past weeks.
And I think
have you discussed the
for
future
US
of
to come back
over the
NAT Bank, the
microphone.
North American Development Bank?
Sid, do you mind?
Okay.
Yeah,
That was
Have you
different.
discussed with Secretary Mnuchin the future of the NAT Bank,
From the
considering
revolver,
that
yeah.
the U.S. administration will probably diminish its
Anyhow,
contributions?
so, I can keep on talking more about it, but I believe there is a great opportunity because India offers a growing economy, big market. If US job has to have to be created, ultimately it has to be based on manufacturing and services. And if the manufacturing jobs are to be created, then the goods have to have some market. Of course, US is a big market, but apart from that, India offers a very large market for US goods. And I think what I see is today India offers a great opportunity. It is at the best of, I would say, time in many, many years that India has a very positive outlook on economy and growth. And we can see clearly there is, that one can see when the two leaders meet, some positive outcome coming out of it. First, you want to add something?
Please, Harsh. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my senior colleague has really comprehensively covered the entire gamut. So I'll just add a couple of points. I think one of the things that we've seen with the Modi administration coming into India is that the narrative changed from a multi-party system now to you being either with Modi or against Modi. So I think one of the things that he did was really see that this whole debate in the country of whom you should support is now one or or amongst the others you can fight for your space there. The other thing that I think he brought in is a paradigm shift, is that he moved the focus from sectarian, regional, caste, religious appeasement politics to development politics. I think the central agenda again moved from many of these relatively old-fashioned ideas and perhaps not really economically important to a really central idea of how we can develop India and how we can take it to the next level. With this, the entire politics of the country have taken a major change. The other thing that I see is that the kind of people that he has brought into as chief ministers or ministers, there was a sense earlier, there was a sense of entitlement, people who have continued to enjoy power, who continue to enjoy power. There were others who were doing politics as a part-time kind of an activity where you did something but you actually were running a business, or you were in a sense self-serving to a great extent. The focus of the key players of Modi administration are nationalists, nation building, and all those kind of attributes. And he's very, very particular that there is no one at least in any worthwhile role who could have sticky fingers or who could be perhaps compromised. Unfortunately, India had an imagery partly based on truth, but also sometimes exaggerated, that we were very, very highly corrupt, etc. So I think that's a huge change that has happened, and which augurs very well for, and of course there's a cost of adjustment, and there is a lot of the existing players in India have found it challenging and difficult to readjust to this new reality. But once we manage to do that, I think it augurs very well for a very good way to go forward. Now, coming to the India-US relationship, my sense is that what started off with Prime Minister Vajpayee and President Clinton has only gathered momentum over the years. It was further reinforced by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President Bush, and taken to yet another level by Prime Minister Modi and President Obama. And I see no reason why this thing which has been now carrying on for about 15 years will not get further accelerated with Trump and Modi coming together as well. Of course, every now and then changes happen politically, both back in India and the US, and there will be some nuances to some of the issues, like we are discussing about jobs in the US and protecting those jobs, and whether Indian jobs are coming in the way. Now, those are things that there is a politics of it and there is an economics of it, but my general sense is that India and its relationship with the US is a productive relationship for both countries. And I think the leaders will be able to see that, even if they slightly tweak something here or there, it will not be very dramatic as to alter the course of this economic engagement. I feel that the economic engagement will only increase. I also feel that there is, in many of the ways, at least in some of the speeches that I've heard of President Trump, I get a sense that he would find India's plural society, its the way it has managed its democracy, etc., very appealing ideas to him, and there would be a sense of mutual respect. I also understand from some people who have been part of his campaign and who are Indians that he has a deep admiration in general for the Indian people and for some of the capabilities of the Indians. So I don't see a very big challenge, though I do see some tweaking and there could be some temporary dislocation, and some he might do as a part of his poll promise, which he might also undo as we go along. So I would really not put too much equity in that and sort of get very worried about it. That's my personal sense. I do see this relationship only headed towards a much more meaningful engagement between the two countries.
Yeah, well, great. Well, I think, one of the points that, and I'll have a couple of questions to prompt the speakers, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I think one of the issues that, Matt had hit on was in terms of the outlook on trade agreements. And, I kind of wonder what do CEOs in India, what does FICCI think as an institution? The United States backing away from Trans-Pacific Partnership, India's involvement in RCEP. We look at it and we wonder, we hear announcements, of course, coming from China that they're interested in sort of taking on more of a global leadership role if the United States is retrenching a bit in our views on trade. How does India look at the potential changing sands on these big trade agreements that are out there, TPP, RCEP, and others? Is it an opportunity to stand up? Is it not really kind of stoking interest? I know there were a number of studies showing that, TPP and the fact that India wasn't included could actually be harmful to the Indian economy. So is it, in some ways, kind of a good thing? You've got a little bit more time to try to orient a new trade policy. How does the shifting sands on trade, RCEP and TPP, how does that kind of look from FICCI and from your perspective?
So I think as we see from Indian government point of view and also from our point of view, India is willing to actually take a more aggressive role in RCEP and get into that. Of course, currently we are not part of it, but India would be willing to get into that and take a ring load. But I think India also is trying to develop the Southeast Asian thing. So there is a concerted effort being done to develop a Southeast Asian region where large population and large market exists to create a kind of a trade agreement and do that. So that could be kind of a regional things happening as well.
Well, I think India has had a mixed experience in dealing with these trade relationships. Many of them have worked well and many of them have actually been not so favorable. And so I think it's work in progress. I don't think there's very strong policy clarity yet in the country. It's still evolving. And I think India would be happy to be open-minded on this and would be happy to engage with all countries and see how we can. I don't think we have a hawkish position that we will only do this and not something else. So if there's something that comes from the American side which appears to be more rational and generally more beneficial, and India has had a tradition of looking at the world's interest together with its own. So it's not going to look at it in a very isolatory sense that it's only our interest and that's it. So I think that's been the general culture of the country. So I think.
On that question too, Matt, I wonder if you have a thought on it. I mean, do you think China really is ready to step in if a void is there? And I know you spend a lot of time on Japan too, and Japan's interest in TPP. I mean, seeing another huge economy start to show interest in integrating. Are we going to be left behind? Is it a space for Delhi, for China, things like that? I mean, do you think there's appetite among those other big countries, even if we're not going to do it?
Yeah, so I was going to say on TPP that you're right that there is analysis showing that India would have been hurt by trade diversion if TPP had gone forward as is, and to me that's a problem for India. But another way to look at it is that's an incentive for India to want to be part of this sort of regional trade agreement, because there's an opportunity to create trade and have India be part of that and even to be a leader in that. But And you mentioned the Japan example. I mean, Japan precisely was, a lot of eyebrows went up when it was suggested that Japan might join this agreement, because Japan had not shown a willingness to address some of these long-standing market access problems in agriculture and automobiles and so forth. But in fact, the Japanese government, it wasn't just this government, Abe, his two predecessors actually saw the power of this as a tool to drive domestic reform in Japan. And indeed, Abe has carried forward with some agricultural reform, and it had a very beneficial impact. So I think that's the way I would look at TPP if I were India. As for RCEP, I mean, here in Washington, the general view about RCEP is that it's not moving fast. And usually people say because India's in it, and India won't allow RCEP to go very deep or broad or quickly. And you know, there is, therefore, again, thinking of glass half full, there's an opportunity for India to prove that wrong, and to move forward with China and Japan and the Southeast Asian countries to get that agreement done and make it broad and deep and include some of the rulemaking that was in TPP. Probably not all of it, but I mean, some of it I think you could import. And frankly, as an analyst of American interests, and I think that wouldn't be a bad thing if RCEP were to move forward. It would create a little competitive heat under us to want to get back into this game. Right now, it doesn't seem like a very credible threat, but I do think there's an opportunity for countries like India to step up and take advantage of this. You know, it is a void if the United States is not playing in this Asia-Pacific regional integration story.
And Pankaj, Harsh, I mean, do those words, Beijing taking global leadership on trade, does that raise concern generally, or is that something Delhi is fairly comfortable with? And I mean, how does that ring when you hear those kind of words put out there in public by, you know, leading global institutions that China wants to take this position? Is it worrisome to see Beijing in the lead, or is that something Delhi would generally be comfortable with, or do you think it's not reasonable? Do you think China is really not ready to open up its economy more fully?
I think India's stand would be to be an equal player into this, and may not accept the dominance of one more than one of the countries in any of these kind of negotiations. I think that would be what India would look at, a kind of a equal role than just to have somebody playing a major role and we just playing a secondary role in that.
Yeah.
That's the way we will see
I
that.
think just like to add that deeply the comfort with the US would certainly be higher than perhaps it is with China. And it is only because of the fact that there is not enough information available about how things work and how the thoughts work in China. I think because of the opacity of that economy, the opacity of that political leadership, there is, but otherwise I think culturally we are in the same continent, we have similar, very, very strong ties through Buddhist links, etc. So I don't see there should be any problem there, but except for the fact that the information flow from that country to be able to make intelligent, knowledgeable assessment is not forthcoming as much as it is, say, from the US.
Yeah, I don't know, Rajan Mittal, I know you've been obviously following India's engagements on multilateral and bilateral trade agreements for a number of years. It's great to have you here. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this as well. We were talking a bit about, of course, China talking about taking leadership as the United States retrenches in our global views. Do you think this, I know you've been at the negotiating table with government for a number of years on these kind of things. Is it a market opportunity for a company that has active operations, around the world as well?
There is an opportunity and there's a challenge as well. Unfortunately, the needle is moving towards more to be protecting your domestic markets. When India's opened up, and today probably, if I have to say, is the only economy which is actually opened up completely. I would say there's not even probably one or two areas left, otherwise we are actually such an open economy. And the world is moving towards protecting their home base. And of course, bilaterals are becoming order of the day, which is not good news. After all, the global economy has to shape up. The last 40, 50 years, it was all about globalization, and suddenly we are all about being protective about it. So it's a cause of worry. especially for countries like India, which are now emerging out of the shadows over the, I would say, last few years, becoming a global power. Companies are stepping out to invest. It is a challenge, but also a great opportunity for companies like us and many other companies who sit here and across, that we will be able to make a mark differently. And we are also hoping that better sense will prevail over a period of time. Nations will come back on a multilateral platforms. It will engage more sober countries like U.S., China, which are big blocs, and India hopes to be on that table.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, I will say one last thing on trade too. I don't know, those of you who follow the numbers in kind of a regular fashion, but the government of India has released its final trade numbers in goods trade for fiscal 2016-17. And it was the first time since India began to open its economy in the 90s that India for 2 consecutive years now has actually seen a reduction in its good trade deficit. The first time since 1988 that there's been consecutive years of its trade deficit reduction. So in terms of those, what we see is the reluctance to engage on trade. That's a great sign. I mean, partially driven by oil, of course, but we've seen in recent months India's exports are starting to pick up a little bit too. So some fairly good signs out there. We saw the executive order come out on Buy American and Hire American, and it talks about for a few months to do a study of Buy American and is it working? Are there new rules that should be in place? And Hire American, this notion about making sure that American companies find the best workers rather than immediately going to people to come across on visas and such. We don't know what a final shape might take on this. There's lots of opining out there, some by members of the administration. Probably, the rough parameters might be an H-1B visa regime that remains at 85,000, but favors companies that are based here or have the majority of their workforce as Americans rather than H-1Bs or something like that. There aren't that many trade concerns that I think India has going our way, but this is a big one. And it impacts an industry that has actually driven a lot of growth and export growth in India. I'm personally getting a lot of phone calls from journalists these days asking if the United States takes a big step on this, is it something that would yield a specific reaction in India? Is this something that could be the first step in some kind of a trade spat? I wonder if you think, from Ficki's perspective, an H-1B limitation restriction, how serious is that on the scale if something comes out? Do you expect to see a reaction from Delhi in some other fashion, or is it something that companies can probably absorb and move on? Or is it so far away that it's really kind of tough to wrap your mind around what the reaction might be on that?
So I think we have not heard anything from the government that we can say government's view. My personal view and based on experience would be that I don't think Delhi would react to that. However, it will not go very smoothly with the in the oral relationship building exercise. So it would definitely become a kind of a sore point, and it would impact any kind of bilateral discussions which might happen at a later date.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, we can open up I see a lot of hands coming up here. Let me just, we got at least one microphone coming around, 2 microphones coming around. All right next to you there, Sid. Let me, if you don't mind.
Went wrong. Did India miss the bus? All these from Obama to Trump, like H-1B and also yet Prime Minister Modi is not welcomed by President Trump. Thank you.
He's not welcomed?
To Washington, among other leaders are coming and going. Not
He's
100 days first.
So I think they're making groundwork and preparation so that when the visit happens, it is more fruitful.
Yeah, I don't know that there's anything that could have been done differently. The Trump camp wasn't ready, they didn't have a lot of folks ready to take key positions even after they were elected. So the idea about engaging, who did you engage before that period there? So I don't know that there's so much that could have been necessarily done differently. I think even for those of us here in Washington, just seeing how the election campaign swirled into an uncertain outcome there, it was a little bit surprising. So in hindsight, you would have really had to have a magic crystal ball to have figured out some way to do it differently, I think.
I mean, in every new administration, there's a period of getting started up, and not every issue gets resolved in the first 100 days. And so on some level, I think it's not surprising that this hasn't all been thought through or taken care of yet. I mean, I think this administration is probably a little behind the curve, maybe more than a little, because they weren't really prepared for governance. I don't think they expected to win, and they didn't have all the plans, policy, or personnel laid out in advance, as probably Hillary Clinton's campaign did. And so they've been scrambling to catch up, and then there are only about 20, 25 people who have actually been confirmed by the Senate in political jobs, and maybe another 20 or 25 who have been nominated, and there are another 500 that there aren't even names yet. So there's nobody named, who's going to be working on India specifically yet at a political level. So there's I think it's just a startup problem, really, not a sign of a different approach necessarily.
Somebody that's served in government.
I think that's a little oversimplified.
Both in elected office and appointed office. Ray Vickery.
Yeah. So Ray Vickery from Hogan Lovells. Rick, you started out your remarks by saying how much we'd achieved in the security area and the defense area, and how far that had gone, and contrasting it with what had happened in the economic area, that we have a number of problems that have not been resolved. And Matt referred to the fact that India is not in the crosshairs. I would submit one of the reasons it's not in the crosshairs is because the economic relationship has not been commensurate with the overall strategic relationship. So the question really is about opportunity cost. Before this past election, there were many who were talking about next steps in the U.S. India relationship, a more open trading regime, taking care of these problems, how to bring India into TPP and so forth. And I wonder, from a FICCI perspective, is all that just dead now, or is there still an appetite for opening up further in India and asking the United States to open up so that we might have an economic relationship which is commensurate with the strategic relationship?
So I think trade-related reforms in India will continue, irrespective of whatever is happening here. That's what my view is. And government would make economy even more open. So some of the areas where, like for example, retail and other areas where economy has to open, we clearly see that those are the things that are going to happen, irrespective of what happens between the discussions as far as some of the areas on visas or any similar areas. India will continue to do it, and I think India is willing to go a step forward to actually enhance the bilateral relationship with all countries, including U.S.
Well, and there is, lots of speculation too that in terms of India's own domestic reforms, the finance minister announced during the budget speech they would, for instance, do away with the Foreign Investment Promotion Board pretty soon, and approvals would then move to the automatic route, which is, it's not a huge hurdle, but it certainly is a hurdle. And a few other FDI caps too have been talked about pretty openly. I know the food processing minister is coming to the United States, and she's been arguing very strongly about further liberalization on the retail sector for foreign investment. So could be a couple of things on the anvil. I think a lot of American followers, I've been surprised on GST, the number of American executives that don't spend a lot of time thinking about India, but when they come through CSIS, they ask very pointed questions. What's the status of GST? How's Mamta Banerjee going to vote on it, or things like that, which like a CEO asked me about Didi, my eyebrows go up pretty high, so a little surprising there. So I think some of the domestic regulatory reforms you talked about, I find American executives following it closer than I'd seen in my 20 years. It will come up to the front row there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is
We got a microphone coming? Yep.
Hi, my name is Ita Sindhuja. I am the Chief Communications Officer of Gab AI. It's a upstart social media company fighting for free speech. My question is, so America has had a very great relationship with the developing world and global south in fighting for liberalism, democracy, free speech. We can look back at the Bush administration previous to Mr. Obama. How do you believe Mr. Trump, or President Trump, pardon me, would approach this relationship with Prime Minister Modi and really seek to, ensure that people on the internet aren't getting censored, aren't getting, stifled for having different political opinions? Thank you.
Is there a role for a Trump Modi to try to talk about internet regulation and free speech? I don't know that there necessarily would be. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
I don't know how much possible it is also in this kind of explosive, interconnected world to really be able to do that.
Yeah.
So the first thing that technology is leaping so much ahead that to be able to contain it and control it, to me, seems to be increasingly difficult. And therefore, I'm not sure that they would really put too much of time on that.
I do hope. I mean, part of the issue with this is too few Indians are actually connected. I mean, the idea about censor or media or anything like that, it's hardly even an issue for the 700 million that don't have internet access yet. And you look at the imbalances in the Indian economy, lack of internet penetration, to me, is one of the biggest. And you sort of expect that at some point they'll figure out among multiple pathways how to snap that back and bring it back to countries of India's income level and such. I sure would love the United States to find a way to be a strong partner in that, whether it's going to be satellite, broadband. I mean, there's obviously great companies in this room that are leading the charge on that, and it would be great if there's a role that we could play to support that. So,
I mean, more positively, there hasn't been any real indication from the Trump administration about how they're going to handle those sorts of issues, or how much they're going to push those issues, and their reasons to believe this may not be the highest priority for them as they go around the world. But on the other hand, I mean, I think the fact that, as you said, the U.S. and India and the U.S. are the two largest democracies in the world, and we have shared values about things like this. I think that I would expect the two leaders to talk at that level and want, at least in a general sense, to be promoting things like an open internet where there can be, dialogue and business and other things done on the internet. I hope that then translates into joint work on establishing principles of free and open internet, of cross-border data flows, not data localization. And I'm not sure India's quite there yet, but those are part of a package as I see it. So I hope they talk about those things.
yeah. Let me take the third row right here in the corner. Yeah.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. This has been a really interesting discussion here, and I think you're right. I do think that from the reporting, the Indian government has ratcheted up its statements regarding H-1Bs. There was a report that the finance minister raised this with Secretary Ross pretty strongly. Of course, Ross indicated that this is being studied, et cetera. At the same time, we have, of course, a very strong talking point that the Indian government and business likes to use, that Indian tech workers and in other ways there's a tremendously good marriage between Indian technology and U.S. technology, and a lot of numbers to back that up. And also the last piece of this is, of course, what Matt was saying about what sorts of agreements might we be able to fashion. Obviously, you've said that you're still thinking about that. There are not a lot of people in the U.S. government to talk about that. We have seen not a lot of movement in the bit between U.S. and India. We've seen that the U.S. government now says it wants to defund OPIC, so maybe they're not particularly strong about pushing American investment and supporting it. I guess my question is, how do you connect these dots? Is there something that makes sense for the two countries to do in the tech space, whether it is something that incorporates what you just said, Matt, previously, about something on the internet, maybe something involving the H-1B, something involving U.S. market access, and maybe not the localization provisions on the Indian side for manufacturing. Is there some new idea that could be put together between the two countries, something that maybe has not been thought of before, that would make sense, that could be developed?
Can't think of a new innovative idea. I do feel that we are probably getting more worried than we need to be. My general sense is, I think it's early days. As Matt said, President Trump probably didn't expect to get elected and therefore didn't have a real team in place. And it's just 100 days. And I think getting to a strategic level of meaningful engagement with a country like India without a team, it's very, very difficult. I think it's very difficult even at company level when you don't have senior management in place to negotiate critical issues with other companies. So I personally sense that we should really address this challenge, if any, a few months down the road, once President Trump and Prime Minister Modi meets. I think many of the concerns that we are expecting may be resolved in that itself. And there may be much less issues to be really concerned about as far as the engagement between the two countries.
And there are a few novel things. Probably most significant is the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative. I mean, not created for any other country in the world. The United States offering specific technologies for co-development, co-production. We have 6 projects, 2 other working groups, aircraft carrier and jet engines. And I think carrying those out too, I mean, that's about as cool and interesting as it gets. Progress has been slow, but getting those kind of things to fruition, I think, is going to be the key to unlocking what the next steps are. I mean, I think with what Prime Minister Modi has done on trying to really open up for the private sector, the defense space, delicensing, foreign investment rules, that kind of stuff. As they said, there aren't that many sectors that are really sort of closed to foreign involvement. Defense hits both the economic and strategic. So I just hope some of these interesting things that were initiated in the last administration too are kept and grown, because I think there probably is nothing I'd put on the table more interesting with potential than what we're doing on DTTI. I see Cap back there. You could always see with the shiny haircut when Cap raises his hand.
I don't get many haircuts anymore, Rick. Thank you. Actually, my question is, I found the conversation to be very interesting. I don't share your optimism on the trade side, mainly because I think that both leaders have one issue in common, and I'm not sure how they're going to reconcile that. That's both have to create jobs. And India has a lousy record on job creation. And I just don't see where they're going to create jobs. So if they're going to open up the markets in India further or liberalize, where are the jobs going to come from? I'm not sure it's going to be in manufacturing. Tech is losing jobs, mainly because of automation more than anything else, artificial intelligence. So as business leaders, I'm curious where you see job growth really happening in India, just like we're struggling here in the United States with job growth. I think, in my opinion, it's political leaders not accepting the fact that they can't create jobs, and that it's really going to be up to industry, and we need realistic talk. But I find that industry in India is afraid to do the realistic talk. So I'm curious, where do you think jobs are going to grow and come from in India when they only created, I think it was 140,000 jobs last year, when they have to create 1 million a month?
I do agree. This is the single biggest challenge. But the question is that would protectionism or would sort of looking inward be a solution to job creation? And my general sense is that the only solution to job creation is actually faster economic growth. And not really, even if for argument's sake, protecting creating some kind of trade barriers, etc., could create some temporary relief in some sectors, I really don't think it's sustainable. So if it is a long-term sustainable job creation, or I would not say job creation, I think we need to move towards an economic activity that a person can find a way to earn from. It need not be a job. It could be ways that he could earn a living for himself by being perhaps self-employed or doing some enterprise. So job typically in common parlance means working for somebody or working for big corporates. So I think the opportunities that are emerging are more in entrepreneurs, startups, and smaller things than in really big companies. And I feel that faster economic growth is what the leaders should focus on. And therefore, if cooperation between US and India by opening trade barriers can actually lead to faster economic growth, then that is, to me, a better solution than closing the doors. However, I'm not an economist, and therefore I want to put that as a caveat, because there could be an economist viewpoint which is quite different.
You want to touch on this, your book, Economy of Job?
Well, we did a compilation of that, and you're right that there is a dismal situation. But economy is readjusting itself. Indian economy had a lot of sloth and fat. If you take any company, we were all heavily overemployed. So what has really happened because of the slowdown over the last few years is that while there has been growth, there has actually been no jobs, because people have been rationalizing, even in companies that have been profitable. If you ask many large corporates, many in this room, if they've added actually people, they would say no, but they've added turnover and they've added profitability. So what has happened? They've essentially used the people better, because there was already a certain amount of redundancy available. I think we are pretty much near the end of that. So now the next tightening there may not be much scope for further tightening, and therefore job growth will come in. That's my general sense. So,
do you want to add anything? No. Oh, okay. I was just going to add, growth is good, and I agree. Growth is what we should focus on. But also, I would add in there, human capital investment. I mean, I think we need to make sure that people have the skills that are needed. I agree with you. It's not about getting jobs. It's about having the skills needed to be able to deal to survive in the new economy, and that's not easy, because even think tankers maybe have to be a little afraid that someday they're going to be robots sitting up here, not us. I think it's hopefully going to be, we'll be behind our desks with bamboo sticks fighting them off, I think, at the end. But seriously, I mean, it is obviously very challenging, but I think that's another part of this. We need to grow and give people the skills they need to be able to deal with these new economic realities, and that's I think the challenge for public policy.
Well, that's where I think,
protect.
the way that you've seen Prime Minister Modi engage the United States, meeting with these executive groups all the time that he's coming across. And a lot of times it's, tech. I mean, he's sitting around with Facebook and Google and things like that. But, as my colleague, Sarah Watson, wrote, I think it was about a year ago, by the Reserve Bank of India's own numbers, India generates far more jobs on things like paper mills and textile factories than they do on tech. And yet, you see, like, in terms of what Modi would like to see on American economic contribution to India, it's focused on the sectors that a lot of times generate less jobs. Sure, Make in India, but even in Make in India, he's talking about sectors that are absolutely robot-driven, high tech and that kind of thing, semiconductors and things like that. So I think for U.S. India, too, there is a potential reorientation, although certainly the idea about jobs shifting to India is something that, the U.S. administration won't focus on. But in terms of outreach to American companies directly, would make some sense, is aiming for sectors when it approaches the United States that are a little bit more job-oriented.
I'd just like to add here that, I read somewhere that ever since the World War I till now, the world population, sigma world population, is about 3 times. And for the last 3-4 years is the first time that the world population is actually not growing. It's probably at some minuscule percentage falling down. So in the last 70, 80 years or 100 years, we have never seen a world where the world population hasn't been growing up. And one of the big contributors to world growth was the fact that there was more people. The fact that the next 10, 20, 30 years, the world population will actually go southwards, even if it is by small percentage points, a very, very important reason for growth will get eradicated, because there are going to be less people. And therefore, there is going to be a paradigm shift. Another thing that I read was that in many of the developed countries, particularly Scandinavian countries and other countries like that, people are working much less hours than they ever worked before. And that also means that new opportunities are opening up for leisure because people have less working time and more time for leisure. So it's shifting, and I think if the world requirements are going to get met and a lot of robots are going to come and replace us, we're probably going to relax and enjoy, and there's probably a new industry of leisure will open up for business.
Well, let me before I reopen it back up to the audience, that sort of triggered when you're talking about major global shifts. President Obama, I mean, his primary reason, I think, for engaging Prime Minister Modi after Modi came to office was looking at India as the linchpin for global emissions and environment, both in terms of getting a Paris Agreement and India's contribution, but then also the decision that India makes today on what kind of electricity goes into its grid and things like that is going to have the single biggest impact of any country on earth. Trump comes in, less interest and orientation on that same topic. India at the crux of this saying, you know, we want to be able to grow, we don't want your imposed limitations, you emitted as much as you wanted during your growth phase. But at the same time, you know, the Prime Minister is doing these things, you've got solar companies, wind companies, you've got great things happening on the ground. How's the debate? I mean, is it a relief that this no longer is going to be issue number 1, 2, and 3 when you engage the United States? You've got to do more than your share, India. You've got to take on a burden. I'm sorry to ask this, and or is it there's so much momentum behind it? Does business look at it as something that investing in green energy and green technology is just so self-evidently worthwhile as an investment now? What's the kind of mix on that? I mean, that had been such a driver of U.S. India economic and strategic relations, and suddenly it's going to be off. Will the momentum continue, do you think?
So I think it will move parallelly. I think India is conscious that it needs to play its role in the world to reduce the emission of CO2. And while it will move towards more greener technologies and move towards using gas alternatives, etc., it will continue to burn fossil fuels to the extent it is required to propel its growth. But we will be seeing a very declining use of fossil fuels in a much sharper way than it happened in the West in the past. And I think this dual process is the only way that we will get to the stage when our emission standards could be well within the world norms.
Yeah. John? Yeah.
Thanks very much. Jonathan Ward, University of Oxford. Rick, I know I ask you about this every time we see each other, but I want to ask about the concept of Mission 500, of the idea of getting U.S. India trade to $500 billion, particularly to Mr. Patel from a FICCI perspective. I mean, could it be that this is a very useful organizing concept for the U.S. India relationship? I mean, can we sort of put a plan and a time frame on this sort of concept that's been lurking around for years at this point? Thanks.
So how do we get to 500 billion? How do we get to 500 billion in U.S. India trade?
So I think you start exporting gas to India. That can India would definitely will look for a more secured energy supply. So one of the area which can make a huge impact towards moving towards this is supply of gas. I believe that if economies are going to remain inward looking, then I don't think we should even talk about this number. But if we're only going to look at economy opening up, then we can talk about this 500 billion number and discuss more about it. I think ultimately there will be compulsion. Every business would require growth, and the growth cannot be only inward. It has to be because there are opportunities. And we all know that, you know, there was a talk about emerging market, and now we're talking about the next billion in the Africas and other areas. If you're not going to be able to do anything about that and explore the market, our businesses wouldn't have growth opportunities. Because some of the markets where we are already, like in US, the consumption has gone to the highest. Now, how much more a US consumer is going to buy?
Every day I go to Walmart, I find more things to buy. So they seem to be, they're pulling me in. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tejinder, yeah, up in the front.
This is Tejinder Singh from IIT and the European Weekly. First, let me clarify that anybody who has read the executive order hasn't done, you don't get anything about H-1B visa from that. H-1B visa was largely talked at the background briefing at the White House for nearly an hour or more. And they talked about, there was a question about that reduction. There's no reduction in 80, because this is Congress mandated. Please don't read the Indian media and, lawyers. It's completely bogus. I'm really, angry about that. What they are talking about, President Trump, is taking out the fraud and abuse of the system, bringing back the real, why it was started, to bring good talent. So if my question is to the Indian delegation, how do you see, there was a press report, the visiting finance minister is going to talk to the US officials about H-1B visa. Are you going to talk to the Trump administration to stop going and correcting the abuse and fraud? What is that the Indian government has a stand to take on this? Thank you.
So I think one thing is very clear, neither as an association or the Indian government will anyway support any fraudulent activity. So I don't think we would be anyway talking about any fraudulent activity at all. So if there are, concern is that whatever is been talked about currently is that there could be there would be reduction in H-1B visa or refusal to give an H-1. So that is what
it's popularly
nothing is decided today, but it's all what has been talked about in media, talked about by people, etc. Now, if it is wrong, and as you said, what you say is right, then I think there's a good news.
Background briefing is on the White House website. You can go through the first question.
There's a review. They're doing a review, and we don't know where the review is going to go. That's what it calls for. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So we hope that what you say is right. We are all happy. We can clap.
Yeah, in the back there.
Lady.
Thanks. Jack Caprell with Inside U.S. Trade. There's, over the past couple of years, been growing criticism from some parts of the business community here that the Trade Policy Forum and the Strategic and Commercial Dialogue that the U.S. has with India produces a lot of talk and not a lot of action. I'm wondering if that concern is shared from the Indian business perspective, what improvements you think should be made to those dialogues, and whether there's an opportunity to do that under the Trump administration. And then separately, do you think that it would be wise for the Indian government, when Prime Minister Modi eventually does come to the U.S., to come with some sort of opening concessions on trade similar to what the Xi administration or the Xi government did with beef and rice, although those were already promised, but yeah.
Let me ask Matt to lead off on that first one. Is there any bilateral dialogue you've ever heard about that everybody is absolutely satisfied at the end of them?
No, I wish I could offer comfort there, but I mean, I do expect they'll probably, if and when Modi comes here, they probably are going to announce some sort of dialogue. That's been the pattern now with the major economies, at least Japan and China, and so I would expect something, and it'll probably be a different name because you never want to name it the same thing as the last guys, and that probably won't solve. It won't make a huge dent. It won't lead to $500 billion worth of trade, but it's not unuseful. I mean, I think it's helpful to have. I believe talking is good, and I mean to a purpose, and it increases understanding. It maybe solves some smaller problems, and a lot of small problems being solved can add up to something. And to me, the key is whether the White House, and the Prime Minister's office are really committed to moving forward an agenda. And if they are, then, with China, I think that Xi and Trump did agree to have a high political investment in this dialogue. So it has a lot of moving parts, and now 4 parts instead of 2 in the China case. I'm not so worried about that if the leaders are really committed to it and they instruct their top political officials, especially in their own offices. So I think Gary Cohn, for example, should be empowered to drive the China and an India dialogue. And that's, by the way, there's precedent for that. I, once upon a time, for my sins, worked with people in Gary Cohn's position on the U.S. India dialogue of the day. And I think that can help drive action. But I wouldn't hold out great hope for that, addressing some of those bigger concerns, or certainly, really bending the arc of the overall relationship. The CEO forum that was held, I can't remember when that was. Was that Paulson? Was that?
It still keeps going on.
It still goes on,
Yeah.
but I mean, there was a point at which it was particularly productive, I thought, in its early days. And I think those things can be useful if constructed the right way.
So it's not the dialogue that's good or bad, it's the political will of the leaders to take on things they present.
That's what it boils down to.
Yeah. Pankaj? Yeah.
No, I just have a question to Matt on what you were saying is that given that current situations and that limited staff at the U.S. government available at this moment, and we talk about number of bilateral agreements being done and again prioritizing them among them, I don't know when the task can be completed.
Yeah, no, I mean,
every agreement is a challenge, and then
there's a real capacity problem if they're going to go through and do bilateral things across the board. But although one of these dialogues is a little different from an actual negotiation of a treaty that's going to end up being passed by our legislatures, that's a higher bar. So there is more capacity to do these sort of dialogues. So I think you could see, are likely to see that. But I agree with your basic point. I mean, I think NAFTA is the priority, and I think that's why I'm not, as a Japan guy, by the way, I mean, I tell people I don't think the U.S. and Japan are going to be launching a bilateral FTA anytime soon for a couple of reasons, but one of them is because NAFTA is the real priority, and I don't think there's going to be bandwidth for a U.S.-Japan FTA for a while.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we reached 3:30, which is the time I had mentioned to the FICCI team that we would try to conclude here. So thanks, everybody, for coming out today. I think, by and large, as Matt was talking about, we haven't seen as many necessarily anti-trade measures from Trump, but that doesn't mean there may not be some in the pipeline there. I think, as both Pankaj and Harsh had mentioned, really the strength of the U.S.-India relationship lies in India's growth. I mean, it's a market that no American company can afford to ignore and can't get into. So whether the governments lead or whether they're sort of behind, businesses are going to look for that opportunity. And likewise, I think, as you mentioned, Indian businesses finding those great opportunities on this side is becoming an increasing phenomenon. So even if government's not staffed, even if they're not ready to lead, even if India's not in the limelight, this could be a phase where, once again, the private sector is really going to be taking the lead and taking the charge on things. But thanks to you both. Thanks, Matt, for joining. Thanks to FICCI for being a partner in this great event. And thanks to you all for coming out on a very busy weekend in Washington, D.C. Thank you for everything.